All right, so continuing on from the discussion of continuity, we're going to get into a discussion more of balance, or what we might call homeostasis. So, uh, starting at this paragraph, he says, whatever else organic life is or is not, it is a process of activity that involves an environment. It is a transaction extending beyond the spatial limits of the organism. And this word transaction is famously associated with Dewey. So it's a little bit more, implies a little bit more than interaction. You could also say that there's an interaction between organism environment. Dewey's point is that these are not totally separate things, but it's an analytic distinction between the organism on one hand and the environment on the other. But they're really very tied together. You can't have the organism without the environment. I suppose you could conceive of environments without life in them, without organisms. But once you have life, then they're intrinsically tied together. So a transaction extending beyond the spatial limits of the organism. So life is something that's not just within the organism, but it involves an environment as well. An organism, so going on, an organism does not live in an environment, it lives by means of an environment. So that's this idea of transaction. Breathing, the ingestion of food, the ejection of waste products are cases of direct integration. So you're directly involved in the environment. In those cases, you're bringing food into the organism, you're taking something out of the organism, ejection of waste, putting it into the environment. But the circulation of the blood and the energizing of the nervous system are relatively indirect, right? There are some processes that are mostly just going on inside the organism. These are indirectly or relatively indirectly related to the environment. Of course, they depend on environmental transactions, but they can continue to a certain extent independently of the environment. But every organic function is an interaction of intra-organic and extra-organic energies, either directly or indirectly. So every thing that an organism does, every process of an organism involves things going on inside the organism, but also environmental energies, energies coming from without. And that happens directly or indirectly. For life involves expenditure of energy, and the energy expended can be replenished only as the activities performed succeed in making return drafts upon the environment, the only source of restoration of energy. So living involves using up energy, and this can only be replaced by transacting with the environment, by getting stuff, by getting new energy from the environment. And this is, I'm not sure exactly when this idea first came about. I mean, this is not Dewey's original idea here. But this is maybe a relatively new theory of life, kind of more or less post-Darwin, or Darwinian and post-Darwinian. So this is kind of one idea of life that had been circulating up to this time. Not even a hibernating animal can live indefinitely upon itself. The energy that is drawn in is not forced in from without. It is a consequence of energy expended. So you use energy to get energy, right? If there is a surplus balance, growth occurs. If there is a deficit balance, degeneration commences. So if you have surplus energy, you grow. In humans, you see that in modern times. We have a surplus of food, we get bigger, not necessarily in the ways that we want. And if you don't have enough energy, you don't get enough energy from the environment, you degenerate, you get weaker, things break down. He writes, there are things in the world that are indifferent to the life activities of an organism, but they are not parts of its environment, save potentially. The processes of living are enacted by the environment as truly by the organism, for they are an integration. The organism is an integration with the environment. You have this idea that things that don't matter to the organism are not part of its environment. This is another common idea around this time, and still, people still accept this. Well, at least many people still accept this as a basically true idea, that the organism's environment is not everything that's potentially there, or that's there, that might be there, right? But the organism, things are, is kind of the idea of affordances in ecological psychology that comes out of kind of this same tradition that Dewey is a part of and is drawing on, that the environment is what matters for the organism, not necessarily everything that we might be able to find out as actually being there. Going on to the next paragraph here, it follows that with every differentiation of structure, the environment expands. Differentiation of structure here referring to the structure of the organism. As he'll say, for example, new organs, so the body parts, the differentiated body parts, let us say, of the organism. For a new organ provides a new way of interacting in which things in the world that were previously indifferent enter into life functions. One famous example that is really the focus of Mead, George Herbert Mead's philosophy. Mead was a colleague and friend of John Dewey, and Mead focuses a lot on the hand, what happened to the environment when life forms developed hands, especially humans, right? Or primates. But the hand is a very important structural differentiation that has a big impact on our environment, on what the environment is for us and how we perceive the environment. So that's just one example of how a new organ gives a new way of interacting, gives a new kind of environment, makes a new kind of environment possible for the organism. The environment of an animal that is locomotor, that can move around on its own, differs from that of a sessile plant. So the organism is, the environment, I should say, is different when you're able to move around in it than if you're just basically stuck in one place. That of a jellyfish differs from that of a trout, and the environment of any fish differs from that of a bird. So there's a kind of objective sense in which we think that, birds and fish live in the same environment, but for the bird, for the fish, the environment is a very different sort of thing. So to repeat what was just said, the difference is not just that a fish lives in the water and a bird in the air, but that the characteristic functions of these animals are what they are because of the special way in which water and air enter into their respective activities. So these animals are different because air is different in their life activities. Water has a different function in their life activities. Let's see, next paragraph. So with differentiation of interactions comes the need of maintaining a balance among them, or in objective terms, a unified environment. So now we're getting into this idea of balance that I mentioned at first, which is going to be kind of the key theme of the next few paragraphs, or next several paragraphs. You can think of the idea of homeostasis here, if you're familiar with the theory of homeostasis. That word was coined around this time. I believe that dates to 1926. Walter Cannon, famous physiologist, but the idea goes back earlier. So that was around 10 years before Dewey's Logic was published. So with differentiation of interactions, so having these different interactions with the environment among the parts of the organism and the environment, comes the need of maintaining a balance among them, or in objective terms, a unified environment. So creating a unified environment for the organism that serves its needs, or that can potentially serve its needs in maintaining balance. The balance has to be maintained by a mechanism that responds both to variations that occur within the organism and in surroundings. So there's variations happening within the organism over time, and there are variations in its surroundings that have to be dealt with. For example, such an apparently self-contained function as that of respiration, breathing, respiration, is kept constant by means of active exchanges between the alkaline and carbon dioxide contents of changing pressures exerted by the blood and the carbon dioxide in the lungs. The lungs, in turn, are dependent upon interactions affected by kidneys and liver, which affect the interactions of the circulating blood with materials of the digestive tract. The whole system of accurately timed interchanges is regulated by changes of the nervous system. So that's all very complicated, which is partly the point, I think, that all these systems of one organism, we can think of these as separate systems maybe, the system of respiration, the system of blood circulation, the system of digestion. But in fact, they're very interdependent and they affect each other. Changes in one system cause changes in another. Too much of this in one system leads to an imbalance, which can affect other systems, which may have to compensate or which may degrade. So all these things are dependent on each other. And this is maybe the idea of a unified organism, depending on creating a unified environment for itself. So all these things are kept in balance. Yeah, and then of course you have the nervous system behind all of that, kind of trying to regulate this whole complicated thing. The effect of this delicate and complex system of internal changes is the maintenance of a fairly uniform integration with the environment, or what amounts to the same thing, a fairly unified environment. So maintaining balance, you get a fairly uniform, a fairly unified organism, a fairly unified environment. The interactions of inanimate things with their surroundings are not such as to maintain a stable relation between the things involved. So inanimate things, we're talking about non-living, what we can call non-living things. The blow of a hammer, for example, breaks a stone into bits. If that was an organism, we would talk about an imbalance there. The organism has become imbalanced by being broken into bits, and that matters to the organism in a way that it doesn't matter to a stone. So the stone doesn't try to maintain its stability, its stable condition, like an organism would. But as long as life normally continues, the interactions in which organic and environmental energies enter are such as to maintain the conditions, and both of them needed for later interactions. That's a fairly complicated sentence. The interactions in an organism in which organic and environmental energies enter. So through the activities of the organism, organic and environmental energies are, come into interaction so as to maintain the conditions of life. The processes, in other words, are self-maintaining in a sense in which they are not in the case of interactions of non-living things. So organic processes tend to maintain themselves in a way that you don't see among non-living entities that we might distinguish, like rocks and movements of water and so forth. To the extent that those try to maintain themselves, it's a much different sort of thing than in organic processes, where you're taking in energy for the purpose of maintaining a certain process. I won't dwell too much on. There are a lot of kind of edge cases there and complexity there that I won't dwell too much on at this point. But that's the basic fact there is that living things will try to maintain themselves by taking in energy from the environment, seeking out energy, and Dewey will get into that in a moment, whereas non-living things do not do this, or we do not see this in non-living things. So going on, capacity for maintenance of a constant form of interaction between organism and environment is not confined to the individual organism. It is manifested also in the reproduction of similar organisms. So now we're getting a little bit into the distinction between metabolism and reproduction. These are two traditionally fundamental parts of or processes of living things, to defining elements of living things: metabolism, or taking in energy to maintain organismic processes, and reproduction, reproducing the organism's reproduction of itself into other organisms. So reproduction of similar organisms. The stone is presumably indifferent as to how it reacts mechanically and chemically, within the limits of its potentialities, to other things. The stone may lose its individuality, but basic mechanical and chemical processes go on uninterruptedly. So the stone may get broken up, but the mechanical and chemical processes involved keep going on because they're not dependent on the unity of the stone or the internal balance of the stone. As long as life continues, its processes are such as continuously to maintain and restore the enduring relationship which is characteristic of the life activities of a given organism. So that's been mentioned. I've discussed that already, right? The processes of life are such as to try to maintain themselves. Each particular activity prepares the way for the activity that follows. These form not a mere succession, but a series. And this is related to the idea of continuity that was in the previous section that I discussed. So a series, a continuous series of things rather than just one thing following the other, but an interrelated series. This seriated quality of life, or this seriated quality of life activities, is affected through the delicate balance of the complex factors in each particular activity. When the balance within a given activity is disturbed, when there is a proportionate excess or deficit in some factor, then there is exhibited need, search, and fulfillment or satisfaction in the objective meaning of those terms. So these processes, these activities of life are continuous. They form a continuous series, such that when there's a disturbance in the balance of these activities, or within a given activity, when the balance within an activity is disturbed, then it has consequences for other activities. And you get these three ideas, which will be expanded on in various ways later, and which also come up in George Herbert Mead's philosophy, of need, search, and fulfillment. There's a need, there's desire, becomes desire for something, right? This is related to, at another psychological level, desire or the wish, right? Something that the organism needs because of having too much of this or too little of that in its system, right? Then you have a need. At a basic level, these are sometimes called tissue needs, right? Need for food, need for water, need for mates, things like that. And then there's search. The organism searches for something to take care of that need. And then if it finds something, there's fulfillment or satisfaction. And so there's a kind of objective sense of this, which you can then also look at the the psychological quality of that, or whatever, the phenomenal quality of that, the subjective quality of that. But there's also an objective sense of that in terms of the organism's structure and its processes. And then going on, the greater the differentiation of structures and their corresponding activities becomes, I don't know if I read that quite right, the greater the differentiation of structures and their corresponding activities becomes, the more difficult it is to keep balance. So when you get more complexity, keeping balance among all those different aspects becomes more difficult. Indeed, living may be regarded as a continual rhythm of disequilibrations and recoveries of equilibrium. So getting out of, I mentioned this term homeostasis before. So this is getting back to that theory. I don't recall if Dewey actually uses the term homeostasis in the logic, but of course that idea is comes in throughout his discussions of biology. I'll just point out also that this idea is also important for his understanding of aesthetic rhythm. In his book, Art as Experience, this idea of biological rhythm or equilibrium or homeostasis or balance is also very important for where our sense of rhythm comes from. So living is a rhythm. There's a rhythm to living, of getting out of balance and getting back into balance. The higher the organism, the more serious become the disturbances, and the more energetic and often more prolonged are the efforts necessary for its reestablishment, I suppose balance is what he's talking about, but I don't see the antecedent of its reestablishment, or maybe the organism's reestablishment of its balance. I don't know, kind of an odd sentence, which you sometimes get in Dewey. All right, but we know the idea by now. The idea is hopefully familiar. The state of disturbed equilibration constitutes need. So this is need in the objective sense, the organism being out of balance with itself, having too much or too little of this or that nutrient or element or whatever. The movement toward its restoration is search and exploration. The recovery is fulfillment or satisfaction. So again, those are the three three main parts that you might distinguish in the rhythm of life: need, search, and fulfillment. Last paragraph that I will look at today, or in this video, I should say. So hunger, giving an example. Hunger, for example, is a manifestation of a state of imbalance between organic and environmental factors in that integration which is life. This disturbance is a consequence of lack of full responsive adaptation to one another of various organic functions. So there not being enough sources of energy in the environment, you get hunger. The organism is not able to attain enough from its environment. Then you get what we call hunger. The function of digestion fails to meet the demands made upon it directly by the circulatory system, which carries replenishing nutritive material to all the organs concerned in the performance of other functions, and the demands indirectly made by motor activities. So all these systems have needs which depend on other systems. And when one system isn't getting the stuff that it needs from the environment, it has this cascading effect through all the other systems, right? The circulatory system isn't able to get what it needs from the digestive system. The motor system isn't able to get what it needs from the circulatory system, and so on and so on. A state of tension is set up, which is an actual state, not mere feeling of organic uneasiness and restlessness. This state of tension, which defines need, passes into search for material that will restore the condition of balance. In the lower organisms, it is expressed in the bulgings and retractions of parts of the organism's periphery, so that nutritive material is ingested. I think maybe he's talking about things like amoeba here, in terms of lower organisms that when they need nutrients, they kind of expand them or change their shape to entrap things in the environment. Last sentence here. The matter ingested initiates activities throughout the rest of the animal that lead to a restoration of balance, which, as the outcome of the state of previous tension, is fulfillment. So another way to look at this imbalance is terms of tension. So you get imbalance among systems in the organism, which we can also describe as a state of tension, which causes, as he says, organic uneasiness and restlessness, a sense that something is needed, right? We're missing something, which is the state of tension that causes us to search, or causes the organism to search, to explore, to maybe change its structure, in the case of these lower organisms that Dewey is talking about, in order to absorb nutritive material. And then this leads to a restoration of balance. The tension is resolved. There's a sense of fulfillment, or there is a objective state of fulfillment, which we kind of experience as satisfaction or feeling fulfilled. Okay, so that is all for now, and then we'll continue on, of course, in the next video.